Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right. I know it's post-lunch, so we're all kind of, some of the blood is going to the stomachs, no longer to the heads. But I am very happy to be here with you all this afternoon. My name is Matthew McNaughton. I am from Kingston, Jamaica. Uh, thank you. A son of as the AU says, the sixth region of Africa. And I'm very happy to be here with you all. I'm from an organization, a nonprofit fund called Co-Develop, and we support countries who are implementing digital public infrastructure, working with on ID, payment systems, exchanges, etc. I actually really want to start first by extending congratulations to Dr. Attic and the ID for Africa team for this AGM. I've been here a few years and I've really enjoyed this one and kind of the mix and the discussions that we've been having today. And I think it's interesting around ID for Africa is that we're all brought together in this community around this core idea that everyone should have an identity. And that every member of our community should have access to a trusted means to prove who they are, to participate fully in an increasingly digital world. And that identity and ID play a central role in realizing a continent that matches the ambition that people have for their lives. And we come to this ID for the community to learn from each other and to encourage each other in the journey as we iterate through the challenges of realizing population scale adoption. But somewhere along the line, in some countries, we've grown more comfortable talking to each other, to other implementers from government, from ID authorities, etc., to the banks, the financial institutions, to the private sector and development partners. We've grown more accustomed to talking to them about those challenges than the communities that we're building these systems around. And this narrative, unfortunately, has emerged that civil society does not share this goal of realizing universal access to legal identification. That they don't understand the difficult trade-offs that sometimes we have to make, or that they're unwilling to balance issues. And so I think my hope today, by the end of this session, is to make the case to you all and to contribute to shifting the narrative that civil society isn't also committed to those goals. And that, in fact, there are civil society, of course, organizations from all across Africa and across the world that are doing amazing work to unlock the goal of universal access to legal identification for all. And my pitch to the ID for Africa community is that we leave a lot of brain power, a lot of value on the table when we don't engage this broader set of actors in this work. And so, looking forward to having that conversation with a very interesting group of panelists, and I will slowly bring them onto the table. And with Slido, many of you who may have had questions about CSOs, about media, etc., will also have a chance to ask questions of our audience. And so to kick us off, I'm going to be bringing on my colleague, Suleimana. Where is he? Okay, there we go. And Suleimana Bramia is the Executive Director of the Media Foundation of West Africa, West Africa's most prominent NGO in the field of expression of interest, media, development, and digital rights. In 2019, he was named an Eisenhower Global Fellow in recognition of his impactful and transformational leadership. So, welcome, Suleimana. All right, that's great. We'll start with you, and then we'll bring on others. Okay. All right, so could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing with Media Foundation of West Africa and how that relates to this broader topic of digital ID?
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Suleimana Brahima. I head the Media Foundation for West Africa. We are based in Ghana, and we work across the 16 countries in the region. that's the 15 ECOWAS member states, and then Mauritania, essentially focusing on freedom of expression, press freedom, media development, media for development, and digital rights. Now, of course, we are here because of the issues of digital identity and digitalization. And I think around the world today and across Africa, the common narrative is that the future is digital and digital is the future. And as we've heard throughout our conversations here in the last 3 days, almost every country is trying to digitalize. And so we're hearing about digitizing public infrastructure, digitalizing public goods and services, whether in the health sector, agri sector, identity for elections, and so on and so forth. And certainly that is all great. But of course, we are also aware, and we believe same to be true, that for this digitalization agenda to have the meaningful impact and the full effect that we want it to have, there are certain fundamental prerequisites that must be present. And these include the fact that it must be safe, it must be secure, it must be inclusive, and it must be participatory. And here we've heard about the issue of inclusion, and I think it's more about who is being left out in the issuance of identity. That is important. But we think what is also important is who is being left out in the conversations and processes that eventually lead to the issuance of the identity. And that is where our concern is. Because we think that inclusion doesn't mean, have I had access to the ID or not? But it's about, has my voice been heard in the conversation? Was I part of the processes and all? What is of course true is that in the process, it's been conversations between service providers, government authorities, deciding, and at the end of the day, cards are being issued, and then you are told, without this card, you cannot register to vote. Without this card, your mobile number will be deactivated. Without this card, you cannot have that. So people are there, and they are basically being issued instructions about what they must have, and without having that, what the implications are. It's almost like prescribing drugs to the sick without consulting them and getting their views on what could be wrong with them. And so what we ask ourselves is, therefore, how do we then help to have the minds, the ideas, the opinions of our people in the conversations? And so we've been doing quite a number of things, including localized conversations between citizens and authorities and service providers. But I think on this platform, I just want to use the few minutes to highlight some work that we started last year, October, with Co-Develop, with support and funding and collaboration with Co-Develop, which is essentially about how do we build capacity, knowledge, and skills of journalists and media organizations across West Africa to develop an ecosystem where we have journalists and media organizations, journalists who are knowledgeable and have the skills about DPIs and DPG issues, and have media organizations that are committed and willing to be able to dedicate spaces and airtime to have conversations about DPIs and DPGs and invite public voices and public opinions into the conversation. So what we've done over the period in the last 8 months has been to basically kind of a piloting to see how successful this whole agenda would be. So we started off with a competitive selection of some 20 journalists from 10 countries in the region. And we spread it across the Francophone, the Anglophone, and the Lusophone countries in the region. So we selected 20 journalists from 10 countries. And then we took them through a series of training sessions, online, offline, about DPIs, DPGs, digital identity issues, the questions that people have as journalists, what they can do, the knowledge gaps they have. We brought them together at some point for 3 weeks to peer learn from each other, to share experiences on what is happening in their respective countries and all of that. Now, between October and now, what we envisaged, our expectation was that if we get these journalists to be able to do some 40 in-depth comprehensive reporting about DPI and DPGs in the region and get their media organizations to commit airtime to discussing these issues and inviting comments, questions, and contributions from the population, we would have been gradually building an ecosystem where the DPI conversation is inclusive and participatory. Now, what we realize is that we actually have exceeded the target, because instead of 40 stories, between October and the end of last month, we have had 116 stories published by these journalists on DPI, DPG issues. Beyond that, there are media organizations that we did a partnership agreement with them, have also committed airtime to discuss the issues of DPI, DPGs, to get to know the challenges that people are going through, to ask questions to authorities for responses. And for me, what is quite intriguing is not just the number of stories that have been produced and the amount of airtime that have been dedicated to discussing these issues, but the fact that some of these stories have actually triggered direct change, such as in Nigeria, where consistent reporting on the challenges of birth certification and the fact that people have to go queue and be exploited, the government then announces that the whole birth certification process is going digital. Apart from that, in Senegal, where the government had invested in a data center that required all government agencies to make sure that their data services are going there, and people were not complying, as a result of a journalist story, the government agencies are now complying to ensure that data is well stored, to ensure people's privacy well protected and all. In Cape Verde, where the government has introduced e-voucher systems to improve tax compliance and all of that, a story highlighting the plight of young and people in the rural areas and the challenges they are having with issuing such vouchers, get the government to make a different arrangement for such category of people. Of course, across the region, people are highlighting the challenges that they are having. And for me, this is evidence of the fact that we shouldn't leave the media and journalists, behind, because they are the ones who will bring the issues to the front burner. They are the ones who facilitate the conversations that would make us aware of the challenges people are going through, the opinions they have, the ideas they have, and be able to contribute towards the process, so that at the end of the day, inclusion is not about whether you have a card or you don't have a card, but it's also about whether my voice is in the conversation or my voice is not in the conversation. So going forward, what we are doing is, having successfully piloted this, exploring possibilities of engaging and collaborating with others to even go deeper, in the countries that we work in. And also we have had this collaboration and an official MOU signed with ECOWAS, which is the intergovernmental agency in the region, and reaching them, with the conversation about how we can have a multi-governmental initiatives within the region, rather than every country is doing whatever they have to do. My Ghana card, which is my national ID, on top of it is ECOWAS ID. And ECOWAS means the 15 countries. But beyond Ghana, my card cannot do much in Nigeria. It can't do much in Senegal. It can't do much in Liberia. And so to have a conversation where there is that multi-government agenda around the DPIs is something that we will do. But at the end of the day, it's all about citizens' voices being heard and citizens' opinions being included in the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sulemana. So, you talked about a number of things and a number of ways in which these stories are actually creating kind of value to the work that's happening in a number of different countries. I suppose my follow-up question to you then is, what would you say is it that people or the persons within government or other actors least understand about working with journalists on this issue?
Well, I think to start with, there's always this misnomer or some misunderstanding that journalists are always out there fishing for information, and bad news sells, and therefore journalists are not always interested in the positive news, but they are always looking out for something negative to tell. But that, I think, it's not a correct way of looking at things. When journalists are engaged, such as are illustrated, before this DPI journalism initiative in the region, if people are complaining in the community that, oh, my card, because I don't have a national ID, my mobile number has been deactivated, I went to the hospital and I cannot access health service because I don't have this card or I don't have that card, the journalist is supposed to highlight these. And in the end, the authorities read these reports and say, oh, journalists are basically fomenting trouble because they are highlighting the challenges that favor the people's opinion and all of that. I think what is important is to appreciate the fact that you need to reach out to the people. You cannot do that one-on-one. There are media establishments that would help you reach out to the people in their numbers. And so collaboration is critical. During this DPI journalism initiative, some of the things we did was taking the journalists as a group to meet with, for example, the National Identification Authority in Ghana, going to the telecoms chamber, and a few other agencies that are critical within the DPI ecosystem in Ghana. And also facilitating such engagements with their respective organizations and authorities in their countries so that they get to understand what is happening. In the end, the stories that have been done is not about criticizing the authorities. It is about highlighting the challenges and letting them know that these are the bottlenecks and these are the issues that we have to deal with.
Right. And so one of the things I'm hearing and taking away from you, Suleiman, is this idea that we started, and much of the first kind of session in the trilogy, many of the parliamentarians talked about this role of trust building and the criticality of trust to achieving adoption, which I think many persons in this room feel very strongly about. And what I'm taking from you in part is this idea that building trust is also enabled by persons feeling that their voices are heard. And there are different ways that you can have voices being heard in a society, and media can play a role in having those voices being heard and communicated as well.
Absolutely. So here's an example from Ghana. Right now, you cannot have your mobile number without it being registered with your Ghana card. But there was a hell of a time government getting to that stage. In fact, the process was postponed like 3 or 4 times. Okay, by this time, if you haven't registered for your Ghana card and linked it up with your telephone number, it's going to be cut off. Then people don't budge. The time comes and, okay, we gave you a period. We have been, sort of persuaded we're going to extend it for the next 3 months. But mind you, in the next 3 months, if it's not done, we're going to deactivate. The 3 months comes, people are not budged. Then extension again. Until that point where it was almost like, look, this thing is just that those who don't want to do it, don't want to do it. Not because they have a challenge. But even as we speak, not everyone has a Ghana card. And if I don't have a Ghana card and I don't have other services, then what happens? The other issue about trust is that across Africa, and I believe this to be true because we work in multiple countries, citizens tend to believe that this whole ID system is about power, it's about control, it's about surveillance, and it's about winning elections. So right now there is voter registration going on in Ghana, and people are saying, oh, because this government knows that this is the stronghold, they are likely to try and register more people on the Ghana card so that those people can be rolled on onto the system. When they know that this place is not their stronghold, they are not going to register as many people as possible. I'm not saying that is the case, but that is the belief that people have. How do we demystify this whole thing? It's about engaging with the people, sharing information with them, getting feedback from them, knowing their challenges, and actually having a meaningful dialogue and conversation with them all the time.
All right. Thank you very much, Suleimano. Awesome. So we're going to be transitioning to segment 2, and I think we spoke about how media can play a role in understanding some of the dynamics and also having voice being heard. And I think the next two next persons we're going to be bringing on the stage are also going to give us additional perspective on how we work with communities and how to kind of that relationship with communities can play into the role to understand what's happening with the impact of these ID systems. So with that, I'm going to be inviting Elizabeth Atori and Miriam Jamal to join us on stage. And so, Miriam, while they walk up, I'll give some context. So, Atori Elizabeth is a dedicated human rights advocate with over 7 years' experience in advocacy and strategic litigation. She's currently a program manager at the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights in Kampala, Uganda, where she focuses on business and human rights, access to justice, and digital inclusion rights. Welcome, Elizabeth. And Miriam Jamal is a lawyer specialized in the intersection of technology and rule of law with a focus on human rights-centered digitalization. She's contributed to further conversations on digital rights and inclusion at both the local level in Kenya, as well as at international levels through speaking, involvement in research, and grassroots mobilization. Thank you both for joining us today. So I'm going to kick it off. I mean, we were just hearing a few things from Suleiman about the importance of communities being heard and that the role that plays in trust building. I want to start with both of you maybe sharing some context of the work that you're doing to support communities in getting access to legal identification. Elizabeth, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And maybe before I start out, I'd like to recognize the delegates in their distinguished capacities. And I'm really especially glad to recognize the delegation from Uganda, which is where I come from. As Matthew says and has introduced, I am Elizabeth. And the work that we do with the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, which is an NGO based in Uganda, and promoting social and economic justice, particularly looking at the right to health, education, and social protection, is really what brought me to the forefront of advocating for greater access to identity. And maybe just to exemplify where that comes from, I'll just read something that we discovered while we were working. And it's a story of one of the people that are unable to access services because of digital ID. He's actually a gentleman, and quote unquote, this is what he says. As you can see, my leg is sick. I can't move long distances. I tried to send the children to the nearer office, which according to him is about 20 kilometers away, but the officers refused to give them the ID, and I don't have any assistance. I rely on neighbors for survival, and my 7-year-old granddaughter to fetch water. My children abandoned me, and I wish I could also get some money from government. And that's most times where our entry point comes in, with communities that are asking themselves, why can't I be part of a government program like the Social Assistance Grants for Empowerment program, which gives approximately $7 every month to older persons above 80 years. So what we do as an organization is to work with these communities to, first of all, make them understand that they do have a right to identity, which oftentimes for them it seems like it's something that you get when you need government to give you something, which, as we well know, is not the truth. The other thing that we do as an organization is undertake research. And in 2019, we did undertake research on the impact of the ID system, looking at the right to health and the right to social protection of persons in Uganda. And one thing that was spotlighted in that research is the fact that given our challenges with the ID system in Uganda, we have managed to create barriers to access to services because of the requirement of a digital ID in order to access those services. And that seems like something that shouldn't be happening. But if you actually listen to these community stories and understand the plight of these particular communities, then you know for them, having an ID or not having an ID is a question of life or death. These are communities that are at the precipice of just the thin line of poverty and cannot be able to afford a meal a day. And so requiring that they don't get a service because of an ID or putting in place barriers like costs that prevent them from getting an ID does affect them. We've also undertaken dialogue with the government. We led litigation against the government of Uganda and were asking court to allow persons that are older and women to present certain forms of ID, not necessarily the national ID, in order to get these services. Beyond that, I must say that as an organization, the model that we work with is to start from the bottom up. So we have a community advocacy program, which in effect allows the community members to identify the challenges within their own communities and then to be able to support their own community members to get access to services. And we've recently expanded that particular program to include access to IDs. And we've seen a number of wins. We've seen community members hold the hands of older persons and get these older persons to enrollment centers. We've seen community members incur the cost that it takes for older persons to be able to reach those centers. But beyond that, we've seen communities rise up and actually walk to centers and ask that the centers register these older persons or connect and create that linkage, which hasn't been existing as much. As a country, we've taken great steps. We are 10 years into the digital ID system, and NERA as an organization has done wonderful things. We are at about 26 million people with NINs currently, and we are at about 70.2% of coverage. And it seems wonderful on paper, but we need to understand that identity is not the NIN or the number. It's the person behind the NIN or the number. What that then means is for a third of the population that isn't registered, there are actually people with experiences and lived experiences that we need to be able to identify, to understand why are they excluded, and also to see for ourselves where does this challenge stem from. Is it a challenge of costs or is it the legal framework? And I can talk all day, but allow me to hand it back to you, Matthew.
No worries, thank you. But I think please give Elizabeth a round of applause. No, and I think it's important, and this idea of how do we make visible the challenges communities are having accessing these systems is key, right? Because I think the shared ambition is in having all persons have access to identity to be able to participate in society. And there are blind spots that we all have and often emerge as we are introducing these systems, as we continue to iterate around that. Miriam, I want to bring you in because it's something that you've been doing a lot of work around with Hakina Sharia. And so could you give a bit of context on your work, but maybe just focus and tell us about what about communities and community-based organizations can tell us about the effectiveness and operations of these systems as they're rolling out from the work that you've been doing.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'll first start by mentioning that in the past 3 days or so, whenever I'm engaging people, because I had the badge that had speaker, no country on, I've had this question several times. Where are you from? Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan? No one once ever guessed Kenya. Now, with that context in mind, I bring you back to the history of how Hakina Sharia's work started. We straddle along the Kenya-Somalia border. We work in a region, the northern part of Kenya, particularly a region called Garissa. So around 2010, a group of law students were doing work around the constitution and sharing knowledge on the constitution of Kenya. And as they kept on doing their work, a lot of people told them, we have challenge with access to ID. Whenever we go to get ID, we're being told that we're on the refugee database. Or due to the nature of people not knowing exactly where you're from and borders, The issue of vetting, and because of, as we all appreciate, national security issues, because of geopolitical reasons, also constantly kept coming up. So with this in mind, the organization started its work around access to ID, hand-holding people and taking them through either registration processes, or also when push comes to shove, litigation. So in the work that we've done litigation around double registration, which is the registration of Kenyan nationals along borders in the refugee database. And as a result of this, and also cooperation amongst the stakeholders who acknowledge that some mistakes, some missteps had been made, a lot of people were deregistered. Also, we do a ton of advocacy around inclusive digital ID, and through this, there has been several steps that have been taken, including as recent as I think 2 weeks ago, the removal of vetting procedures, although that still requires a bit of, so kudos to the Kenyan government for that. But also, the law still stands, so that has to be taken away as well. So that's a bit of background on exactly what we do, especially with community-based work.
Okay, thank you very much. And so this experience of the communities that you've worked with has been a core part of the contribution that you guys have been making to the ID system in Kenya. I suppose I'll open this question up to both of you in the time that we have for this segment. How do you think that governments can better work with community-based organizations such as yourself as these initiatives are getting designed, implemented, and rolled out?
I believe that governments can work better with community-based organizations in listening. And by listening, I mean listening to research that is being produced, listening to the responses to public participation calls, as well as actively seeking marginalized and minority groups. For example, in Kenya, as I mentioned, there was the decision to remove vetting procedures. I believe that this is concerted efforts from communities, development partners, as well as people within government who acknowledge that this particular issue, if it persists, will cause a bit of delay in exactly where the plans are meant to go. So in that, it seems that there was listening that was done. There was active listening on the memos that were produced. There's active listening on the feedback that had been given on the issues that existed. So that is one of the ways.
Okay. Elizabeth?
And I think a result of that listening for us then is what happens after government listens. Does government act on what they have heard, on the challenges that have been voiced? And can the government then take steps? And then what is the role of civil society in supporting the government to be able to take up their role and their duty to provide identity? A key thing that happens if that particular process is followed is that then perhaps we have identity that is inclusive and safe, and that doesn't leave anyone out. But before that, what we see if government fails to understand the challenges of the communities is that then the most vulnerable people are left out of the system. People like persons with disability who are unable to get their biometrics in because of the way the system was designed, or people like women who fail to access enrollment centers and have to depend on data from their husbands to be able to access services. So we must come to a point where we understand that the question of ID goes to the very fabric of a person's existence. And unlike other services like, for example, health or education, where you can actually decide to switch to another service provider, with identity, you only have one service provider. You have the government. So the government needs to create room for voices that sometimes might be dissenting. Sometimes the voices are highlighting the challenges that the system has. And so they are not the voices that the government wants to hear at the time. But those voices actually provide the lived realities of the communities. So for example, in Uganda, we had quite a challenge with the cost in terms of getting an ID replaced or changing your particulars. And just last week, because the government listened, they scrapped that particular charge, which was about approximately $7 US.
Yeah.
What that does is it opens up the system for everyone. We still have a challenge, of course, with cost in terms of changing particulars that have been registered on the ID, because that particular cost went up after they scrapped off. So we have a back and forth game, right? But it doesn't mean that there is no opportunity for engagement.
Yeah.
If we can engage really well and allow room for civil society, communities, and government to come to the table, then what we will be able to achieve are inclusive IDs that leave no one else. Other than that,
Yeah.
it's just rhetoric.
Okay. Thank you both.
I wanted to add something. In the first bit, in response to that question, I mentioned response to public participation, allowing for people to respond to public participation as a means of listening. However, I would not be lying if I said that public participation has been taken, to some extent, sometimes as a joke. And I mean that a box-ticking exercise. So if governments would be responsive, and I mean properly responsive in taking up the proposals made during public participation as opposed to just doing public participation as a box-ticking exercise, then I believe that would enable the capacity to listen to be better.
Okay. All right. No. Thank you both. Can we give these both the ladies a round of applause, please? All right, so we're gonna come back to that as we kind of transition to Q&A, because I think this idea of what are specific ways we can improve public participation, I think would be great for us to talk a little bit about as when we move into segment 4. But what I heard from both of you, and it builds on some of what Suleimani was saying earlier, is that to achieve population scale adoption, to have the entire society participating, there are ways in which we can build these coalitions with different constituents across the society. And that it's not just about the majority communities or the majority groups, but to get to that 90%, to get to that 95%, to even get to 85%, there are communities that will have different experiences or relationships to the systems that we have to be working with a more diverse set of actors to be able to understand their needs and to bring them into the fold as well. So thank you both. And then for the third segment, and that will bring us to the full panel, we're going to be talking about working with researchers and research institutions. And so with that, I want to invite Mampenda, Nashilongo Gervasius, and Pam Dixon onto the stage, please. Okay. And while they make their way, Mampenda Ba is an associate professor in political science at Gaston Berger University in Senegal. She currently holds an heads their interdisciplinary research center working on several areas and interventions among digital ID and data protection. Pam Dixon is the founder and executive director of the World Privacy Forum, a respected public interest research group. She's an author, a researcher who has written influential studies in the area of identity, AI, health, and complex data ecosystems and their governance for more than 20 years. And Nashilongo is a public interest technologist with over 15 years experience in ICT policy, media, and communication field. She's also a lecturer at Namibia University on the science and technology, and the founding president and board member of the Internet Society and the Namibia chapter. Welcome to each of you. So I want to kick it off with Mampenda and Nashilongo, because oftentimes when we're working at Codeville, we're working with governments who are talking about wanting to build capacity in Africa to implement these systems, to be able to work with these systems, and wanting to be able to work with regional partners on this. And an important dimension of that is understanding how these systems work. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on how can African researchers and academic institutions help governments better understand the impact of these systems and the progress of these new digital ID systems are making in achieving universal identification. Oh, the mics. Ah. No worries. Let's move them down. Okay, teamwork. You can take this one, Suleiman. Okay. All right. Go ahead. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for Idea for Africa for expanding and making provision for this session. Really appreciate it. I want to start off by appreciating that the scope of the public sphere has largely expanded when we're speaking about digitalization, right? But I also really appreciate that the session has made inclusion for civil society and the research community to come and engage on this space. But also recognizing that a lot of other players are very necessary if we are to govern digitalization effectively. So on that, it is very important that we recognize that all these players equally and they are recognized equally and their contributions equitably. So the academic field and the research communities are always known as some sort of knowledge production farms, right? So the best way for them to help government understand impact and the progress is to provide evidential research, highlighting the broader but also the narrower narratives within the application of universal identification. And this is necessary to highlight what is happening against the normative frameworks, the theories, and the practices that is happening, right? And sharing learned best practices. So in this case, it can be understood that digital IDs systems are more than just computerized tools, right? Because they have all of these impacts that we've been hearing here today from our colleagues from Kenya, from Ghana, and many others, right? So multidisciplinary approaches in terms of the researchers are most likely to present comprehensive results that answers to these multidimensional issues. So also multi-stakeholder approaches really at a grassroots level towards conducting of these researches. That includes the funding or engagement within the funding frameworks, the validation of such results when they're produced, and finally also the adopting of recommendations and accepting of these use as results are necessary. What has been happening obviously has been that results, so researches are produced, they are published, and implementing that has become challenging across board, at least from our observation. But also there's a need for that I think academia can close there, or gaps that they can close there. Simplifying the languages. I think we've heard this from the panel with members of parliament earlier, saying that sometimes the language is too technical, and I think this is where academia could come in, right? But it's not just the simplification of this concept, but also broadening the will for public trust and dealing with those issues of privacy and protection of data, as we've been hearing here today. But also, I think a key issue would be coherence in terms of how we are approaching the implementation, but also the policies that are involved thereof. Matthew, should I?
Yeah, let me bring a couple other persons in. And also, if you have your the headsets, if you can put them on for me. I forgot to make that announcement. So we may do some French, we may do some English. But go ahead, Ma'am Pena. Please share with us a little bit about the work and how you see we can engage academia to understand the impact of these systems. Oh, you can't hear me? Oh, it's echoing. Yeah, it is a bit of an echo here. So the question was, how can we work with research and academic institutions, African research and academic institutions, to understand the impacts of these systems? Yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Mathieu. Oui, je vais parler en français pour être dans l'inclusion. Je répondrai peut-être après aussi en anglais. Mais je voudrais commencer peut-être par souligner une très grande contradiction. Avec l'identité universelle, l'identité numérique, nous sommes dans un champ qui est quand même très technique, qui est très spécifique et qui soulève vraiment de très nombreux et de très importants enjeux. Et pourtant, il me semble que la production de connaissances, donc le rôle des universitaires, des chercheurs dans ce domaine est vraiment très latéral, absolument mineur. Alors qu'en écoutant Brahima, la société civile, le besoin de connaissances, en réalité, dépasse seulement l'espace des décideurs, des policymakers, mais les médias ont besoin de connaissances, la société civile, en tant qu'organisation, a besoin de connaissances, la population, les bénéficiaires ont besoin de connaissances, et ceux qui sont censés produire ces connaissances-là, c'est-à-dire les universitaires, les chercheurs, ils sont quand même relativement mineurs, relativement écartés de ce processus. Donc c'est vraiment peut-être d'abord cette première contradiction, cet angle mort en fait dans l'écosystème des acteurs de DPI et de Digital ID, c'est vraiment peut-être ça que je voulais d'abord souligner. D'abord montrer cette contradiction, et donc pour moi c'est extrêmement important de les ramener et de montrer que les universités et les chercheurs, surtout publics, sont vraiment absents de cette discussion. Quand vous allez dans les universités africaines, et en particulier ouest-africaines, ces questions-là ne sont absolument pas débattues. Les experts qui travaillent sur ces questions sont des experts internationaux, des experts globaux, mais la recherche locale, la recherche africaine n'enseigne pas, ne recherche pas vraiment sur ces questions-là, et ça c'est un gros déficit. Alors qu'il s'agit de transformations de très grande ampleur qui sont en train d'advenir dans nos sociétés, qui touchent quasiment à tous les domaines, et le DPI, Digital ID, c'est quand même des politiques publiques. On est tous d'accord que ce sont des agences gouvernementales, ce sont des lois qu'on prend, c'est des investissements extrêmement massifs pour mettre cela en œuvre. Nous avons donc en face de nous des politiques publiques qui ne sont pas pensées avec les chercheurs locaux, qui ne sont pas mises en œuvre avec ces chercheurs. Donc il y a très peu d'évaluation interne, s'entend. Il y a très peu de production de connaissances dans les contextes locaux, dans les langues locales, avec les acteurs locaux. Et ça, pour moi, c'est vraiment quelque chose un point extrêmement important qu'il faut mettre en place, alors que la question des contextes est extrêmement importante, alors que nous sommes dans des contextes où il y a beaucoup d'acteurs externes, il y a un agenda international qui est important, il faut aussi le prendre en considération, et on a toujours systématiquement une grande fragmentation des acteurs, et donc la question de la gouvernance de Digital ID, de DPI, la question de la coordination, la question des espaces de dialogue avec tous ces acteurs-là, ça manque énormément dans ces pays. Je pense que le rôle de la recherche, c'est vraiment aussi de montrer tous ces gaps à tous les niveaux. Voilà. Merci.
Thank you very much, both. I want to bring Pam into the discussion right now. We had a really good discussion around the role that evidence plays and building evidence around the impact of this work. Could you talk and share a little bit about how you've approached that question and the role that evidence plays in being an effective partner on these issues?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Bonjour à tous. Thank you to ID for Africa for your invitation, and it is a pleasure to be among all these esteemed delegates and to have these good conversations. So I am from the US, and so my research questions are a little different, but the importance is just as important. Let me begin with the way that we have worked with governments, and I have to be honest to the research that we have done, so I cannot invent research, so I have to say what has happened. So very early in our days during the Obama administration in the US. We wrote a very lengthy report, 7 years in its research. It was called Scoring of America. It was a report on artificial intelligence, and this report discussed discrimination that was happening in the United States because of data that was being analyzed in ways that created discrimination, sometimes with no fault of the individuals, sometimes a lot of problems. So we published this report in April of 2014, and we get a call from the US White House, and it turned out that Barack Obama, the President Obama, liked the report. He got up the next day and he made a speech about it. And then, a month later, the White House published a report called Big Data, and in this report they featured our work prominently, as well as additional work we had done prior. And so this is the kind of thought leadership that we want to have on government. And the way we did it was through 7 years of work. This is not part-time work, this is full-time, very intensive technical research, policy research, and legal research. That is one example. Another example is the work we did on Aadhaar. I went to India. I lived in India for a year to do field work. I went backwards and forwards and up and down through India with a very small team. There were only 3 of us. And we interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people and wanted to see what Aadhaar was like on the ground. This was in 2010. Much later on, after I had been back and forth to India for quite some time, I eventually published the research in a peer-reviewed journal called Nature Springer, and then it went on to be published in open access through Harvard Journal of Technology Science. And what happened is that because it had so much exposure, the Indian Supreme Court used it in its landmark Aadhaar decision, and it used our theory of do no harm, that ID systems must do no harm. And it reversed some of the very negative aspects of Aadhaar while appropriately keeping the pieces that were very important and helpful to the Indian people, who, by the way, wanted Aadhaar. So these are the kinds of things that we have worked on. And yes, so it is incredibly important for us, our idea of do no harm really causes us to operate. This is our number one principle, but our second principle is that it is not our ideas that matter. It is the truth as we can find it through empirical research and fact-based research. I think most of the people in this room know that when I first went to India, I did not like Aadhaar, I did not believe in it. But because I had to listen to the people of India, because I'm a researcher, I understood that I was incorrect, and I accepted that empirical research. We must be able to release our own ideas and submit to the truth. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Pam. Please, yeah. So I think it's been interesting hearing from each group talking about the role that voice and the sharing of voice from communities can play in enabling the success of these ID initiatives. As we kind of stay from the research angle, I know we're running out of time in this segment, but to ask each of you if you could maybe share an example of an effective partnership or way you've worked with the state. It doesn't necessarily have to be ID related, to help build understanding around initiatives that they're doing to kind of give our colleagues some ideas of ways they could work with researchers or academics in their context.
Sure. I think within the Namibian context, and maybe Southern African in general, there's a number of those collaboration where, whether it's the development communities that partners with stakeholders and the universities. I think for us in Namibia, we had a couple of collaboration with UNICEF, the regulator, and I think one of our departments on computer sciences, and really trying to understand issues of security for children, and not necessarily maybe at digital identities. Other examples I can reflect on, for instance, we have the University of Oxford University, University of Cape Town, that has a cybersecurity center that is, to a certain extent, plays a role in capacitating cybersecurity officials from a policy perspective. That's just some of the ones that I can reflect on. But I also want to reflect on some of the work that we have done in Namibia, for instance. During COVID, we have carried research, really just trying to make people understand how data protection works, particularly in a country where data protection law is still not yet in place. And really, I've just been informed a couple of weeks ago that that research is now being used as materials for academic purposes at the University of Namibia by the legal department. Really, just that's the kind of impact that we should be seeing, but also as researchers, we must be intentional on publishing to provide evidence for the public, yes.
All right, thank you. Pam? Yeah.
Yes, I'm just going to list 3 very brief examples. So the first way is a more formal arrangement. So we have been invited by NIST to join the AI Safety Institute Consortium as a public interest research group. So I am going to be the principal investigator leading that work, and we will be conducting work to figure out how to create standards and benchmarks in artificial intelligence governance. So that is one thing. So that is more of a formal arrangement with the US government through NIST. We do a lot of work in the Global South. So I spent a lot of time last year in Thailand, specifically in Bangkok, working with the Thai government on their AI strategy. We did a lot of socio-technical analyses and a lot of research to assist with that. Currently, we are engaged in Mongolia. I was there for the first time in April. I'll be returning in August, and what I am specifically doing there is training and doing work with the Human Rights Commission in regards to digital identity standards and deployment, as well as artificial intelligence strategy and some other things as well. I think I'll leave it at that due to time. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Oui, très rapidement, Mathieu. La situation, en tout cas pour l'Afrique francophone. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Je disais que la situation pour l'Afrique francophone, elle est vraiment très claire de ce point de vue. Il y a très peu d'exemples de partenariat entre la recherche publique et les gouvernements ou les autres segments de la société sur des programmes particuliers. Ce qu'on a essayé de faire, en fait, c'est d'inverser la tendance. C'est nous, universitaires, comment engager le gouvernement. Vous savez peut-être que depuis l'année dernière, depuis juin 2023, nous avons une convention continentale. La convention de Malabo sur la cybersécurité et la protection des données est entrée en vigueur. Ce que nous essayons de faire, c'est de suivre la mise en œuvre de cette convention dans les 54 pays, de regarder les nuances, les différences dans cette mise en œuvre et d'essayer de donner du soutien en termes de production de connaissances à ces différents États. Donc c'est plutôt le mouvement inverse en réalité qui se produit. Mais il y a très très peu d'exemples de collaboration entre les États et les instituts de recherche locaux. Oui.
All right. Thank you very much.
A quick response to that question as well.
Hmm?
A quick response to that question as well.
Sure, please. Yeah, we're about to move over to the Q&A as well. So please, we've opened it up to all the panelists, but go ahead.
That's okay. In Kenya, in the field of like digital ID, data protection issues, the most recent remix is the decision by the judiciary to ask the Kenyan government to put forward a Data Protection Act. I can see our Data Protection Commissioner is in the room. So that, because we do acknowledge all arms of government are important in this particular perspective, but then in our work at Haki na Sharia, one of the ways we have been able to engage government and work really closely is the deregistration of citizens of the refugee database, and therefore allowing them to access legal ID.
And Matthew, just to add on that, I want to give a very workable example in terms of collaboration between government, parliamentarians, civil society organizations, and development partners in Uganda. So for a while, were shouting about the cost, right? And the fact that older persons are not getting social protection because of errors on their national ID. And it will take a long time for me to explain to you the process they have to go through, but it's such a stringent process. But what we have seen in Uganda is that NERA, the Parliamentary Forum on Social Protection, which brings together parliamentarians pushing and focusing on social protection, development partners like UNICEF, civil society organizations like ISA, have worked together to advocate for some of these stringent requirements to be removed. And what that collaboration brings then is that NERA and Parliament can actually work together to put in place policies. So what they did in northern Uganda and in very specific districts is that then they introduced a sort of vetting process that allows older persons to go before committees that verify their age and allow them to push the process forward for them to be able to get these particular benefits. So that's a good way that collaboration works. But it only works if there's trust built across all the parties and if everyone is on the table.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Okay, so we're transitioning to questions that have been coming up from all of you. And so we're gonna, set up a good amount of time for Q&A, so we're gonna spend some time with these and open it up to the entire panel. So a couple that have been up here for some time, and one that looks like, I think it's very much to you, Suleiman. So I'm gonna put up two questions and then we can come to one. So this idea that poverty plays a tremendous role in creating barriers of access to ID. And so what legal steps are there to address that, and in the work that you've been doing with communities at the community level that you found? And maybe Elizabeth and Miriam, that might be something that you might be able to speak to. And then also, I will not try to read the French. In Jamaica, we did Spanish. I'm not going to read that one, so I assume that one is going to go to you. And so let's start there, and then we'll come back. There's one here also for you, Suleimana, around, I think, they're now coming in very quickly. Is it if it's compulsory for someone to have a photograph in the case of registration of a SIM, if why? It seems like that's maybe the case in Ghana. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew. And I'll take that question around poverty creating barriers. To a certain extent, it's true. The issue around cost, that one needs to be able to get an ID, does create barriers, especially in societies like mine, Uganda being a developing country. So any cost that you attach to an ID gets a person to a position where they need to decide whether to get an ID or to buy their next meal, especially for those communities that are from resource-poor areas. But it's also partly not true that poverty is the only cause of barriers to ID. We have barriers that are embedded in the law and in the design of identity systems. So for example, if the law requires that I need to be one of the tribes in Uganda listed under the Constitution to register, then if my tribe is not in that third schedule, like the 6 tribes that are not in that third schedule, then they wouldn't be able to gain that registration. Or if the particular law puts down stringent requirements for you to be able to change particulars on your ID, to be able to get a statutory declaration, get that statutory declaration commissioned, get it registered with the Uganda Registration Services Bureau. All those are steps that have implied costs to them. So whenever we are designing the systems, in essence, we need to sit down and think about what barriers is this design creating for communities. And we need to start designing the systems with the last user in our mind. And not just me or you seated in the room. I think we come from a very privileged position. But for those particular communities that we want to benefit from the services. So if digital ID is supposed to open up access to services for communities, then we need to start designing the our identity on the basis of those particular communities. And what that then means is we need to think through the system and say, okay, in terms of barriers, what are the challenges that these communities are facing in order to access this ID? One of the key things that has come out particularly is the distance that communities need to travel for enrollment centers. We've taken strides as a country to be able to manage that. We have about 112 enrollment centers in districts in Uganda, but 34 districts in Uganda don't have enrollment centers. And if I say 112, it seems like a large number, but that's just in the districts. These communities have to move 20 kilometers to get to those districts. Can we move the services closer and stop being so district-headed, might be go down to the parish level? All that takes resources, and ensuring universal identity is a resource-heavy position for government. But we need to understand how, even with the resources that we have, how do we ensure that those that are unable to move to these registration centers actually are able to get the services? So that's something we've been pushing for, and yeah, I'll send it to you.
All right, and I'm gonna, I think all of you have a tremendous amount of experience, but I'm gonna ask for us to shorten responses a little bit because I want to bring different persons into the conversation. Please, National Uncle, go ahead.
All right. Sorry, Matthew, I've omitted to reflect on another research example that I think I'll be building on into answering the question. So for instance, in Namibia, we are conducting a ROMEX, which is using the UNESCO principles on an internet that is rights-based, that is open, that is accessible, that is governed through multi-stakeholder approach, but also really dealing with cross-cutting issues of gender and children, just amongst others. And that has been a collaborative work between the Internet Society, the university, and government and UNESCO. So I think that's some of the efforts that should be applauded in going forward. But really looking at some of the cases again on digital IDs that poses the risk on particular exclusionary risks, and that can be used, I believe, in building best case scenarios and sharing within the region. I want to reflect on some of the work that has been done here in Southern Africa by Research ICT Africa by doing digital ID assessments in about 10 of the countries. And maybe if you could allow me, this research was done in Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and really highlighting how a lot of exclusion, how these digital IDs are excluding more people than including them. I think in Namibia we had a case where about 50,000, I could be wrong, or 5,000, older people could not access, their government social grants after being enrolled in this system. It could be an issue of, maybe fingerprints not captured correctly. It could be any of those technical issues that we are dealing with here. But again, those are the lessons, those are the issues that we need to reflect in improving the systems that we are using and making sure that not people are excluded, but more people are included. But again, maybe on adding to what Suleiman was talking about, on issues of the media and reporting, that to a certain extent our media also lack some skills, or needs to be skilled or capacitated on reporting on technologies. Now I was just reflecting on some of the work that when the media want to, or reporting on issues of digital IDs, really looks at rights-based, or who's doing what system is in place, who's implementing it, how much it costs, but really not digging deeper to all of these issues and informing the public and making sure that the public sphere then thrives. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there's this top...
Matthew, can I address that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. So poverty is a profoundly multifactorial complex problem, and it attaches to the context, and it can be micro-contexts as well. So while I understand whoever asked that question to think about a legal solution, a lot of times the laws are in place, the laws are on the books. That tends not to be the problem in every situation. There has to be an analysis per the situation. So after you've done a legal analysis to determine that that's actually not the barrier, then you have to look for the socio-technical problems. And that's when you come into a lot of complexity. And if you look at Rwanda, when Dr. Mukesha was really trying to gain access for people who lived in poverty, what she did is she wrote an incredible article about this, which I'm certain that the good people of ID for Africa can bring to the delegates. But what she did is she ensured that women had childcare to go get their IDs, and that everything was paid for, like the bus transport, etc. Sometimes it's the simplest things that can alleviate poverty. So we have to look at that. And there are other issues as well, but I do think we have to look at it as a deeply multifactorial, look at all the things and really provide the empirical data as to what's the causal factor.
Absolutely, absolutely. This idea of evidence building is an important role in understanding what the different barriers are. And I think both of those play a role. There's the example of the lived experience, and then being able to do kind of this multidimensional research around it. And I think there's a role that the examples of the single stories can play to raise our attention to certain things, but to really understand the issues that needs to also be paired with another kind of understanding of the issues. So I want to bring you back into the conversation, Suleimana, because I think this idea of voice and input was something that you talked about, but I'll hear you and then we'll open it up to the audience. So the top question here is, do you think that it's either due to poor or no inputs from the population is the reason that many digital systems or transformations are encountering challenges or failing? And so this goes back to some of the things that you talked about earlier.
Well, I absolutely think that it is a major contributor, because it is difficult to envisage success in a national program that is supposed to benefit the people when the people are not even aware why they must have this card in the first place. When people are doing voter registration, they know why they want to get a voter card, because at the end of the day, they know I need to exercise my franchise and that is why I need it. But if a national ID system is being rolled out and the people out there don't really know why must I get this, and there are a whole manner of conspiracy theories around it, people talking about, oh, with this government can civil on you, with this government can see wherever you are, with this or without this you may be deprived of your voting or otherwise, then it becomes quite challenging. And I think there is no doubt and there is no question about the fact that governments need to be very intentional and deliberate about co-creation and a multi-stakeholder approach in the implementation of whether DPIs or identity systems. I think a good example of how collaboration proved to work was during COVID. Yes, we may say it was a public health crisis that was about life and death, but the approaches that a lot of governments in our part of the world adopted was quite helpful, because government realized there was no way we were going to be able to mobilize the resources that we need by ourselves, even with the international partners and all of that. And therefore, we needed everyone on board. So you had civil society in Ghana, for example, civil society mobilizing and even making contributions to pool resources together to intervene. You had civil society going to communities to educate people about the safety measures and all of that. You had private sector actors producing nose masks. They didn't wait for imports from China or import from Europe and all of that. What can we do by ourselves to save the situation? And then government was then also contributing. Your WHO was doing its part. And before we realized, the person even in the village knew about COVID and what steps must be taken to ensure that I don't get infected. If I get infected, what must I do? I think almost a similar approach is required in terms of the rollout of DPIs and DPGs and the identity systems that we are talking about. Because at the end of the day, it's about public good. But we are saying it's about public good. do they really appreciate the fact that it's about public good? That is what we need to get them to appreciate. Then there's the issue about poverty. To what extent are we decentralizing the processes of, these identity systems? Or it's just based in the capitals? Initial rollout, 2 weeks in villages, people are getting enrolled on. But beyond that, the person who traveled and couldn't get on, where must they get their card? Travel from maybe a certain village to the regional capital or district capital, maybe equivalent of $5, I don't have. What happens? So I think decentralization is also important, and that comes in terms of the whole thing about co-creation, intentional and deliberate multi-stakeholder approach in the rollout of the IDs.
Thank you very much, Sulemana. Anyone else want to comment on this question around the role of inputs?
Just to give you an example, it's going to be done in Lisbon, and you can start with.
Okay, all right, no worries. Any thoughts on this? Okay. All right, so I'm going to be moving to one of the questions that are a little bit further down the list, and I think this one is probably to you, Mampenda, which is Cameroon has included some refugees in its ID system with the support of the World Bank. What are the prospects for this project long term? No worries. Yeah, so it's the... Let me come down to... No, I have no problems running across. Yes, so the question was that the Cameroon has included some refugees in their ID system with the support of the World Bank. What are the prospects for this project long term?
In which country?
Cameroon?
Oh, in Cameroon. I don't know about this project in particular, mais je pense... Sorry.
No problem.
Mais par contre, la discussion sur l'inclusivité et le caractère universel de ce processus d'enrôlement, c'est quelque chose qui est extrêmement important. Et les populations vulnérables, les populations vivant avec un handicap, les populations dans des zones rurales, les populations nomades, parce qu'on en a aussi beaucoup dans la région. Rappelez-vous, nous sommes aussi dans la région du Sahel, et vous avez beaucoup de populations Fulani, par exemple, qui bougent beaucoup, et la question de transfrontalière, en fait, elle se pose de manière très claire. Et la question des migrants, elle est importante, mais aussi une autre question qui est celle de l'enregistrement des naissances hors des différents pays. Donc la dimension consulaire et internationale de ce recrutement. Donc il faut effectivement des systèmes qui soient extrêmement intégrateurs et inclusifs pour que toutes les catégories de personnes, on s'assure qu'elles soient prises en charge.
Yeah?
I don't want to respond to that question. I want to respond to a different question, if I may. It was directed to me.
Yeah, sure. So I was going to transition to that one next. So there's a question that is directed to you around access as a Global North researcher, but I think I'd also want to broaden it to the broader challenge around accessibility to the processes, right? Because I think there are a number of different privileges and positionalities that we all operate, and that's been one of the challenges that civil society has raised as well, that we've often been outside of the room or different actors have more proximity. So I'll allow you to start and then open up to others to talk on that idea.
I agree with you. So I want to address this issue because I have to tell you something. When I went to India, I was a different person than I am now because I had never seen such poverty before. And I chose to really live among the people who lived in extreme poverty so that I could understand my own privilege. Mm-hmm. Each of us has a box that we live in due to the circumstances of our own birth over which we had no control. It is our duty as human beings to understand the box that we are in, to understand our blind spots, and to intentionally get out of them. I did that by going to India. I do that every opportunity I have because I understand where my blind spots are, and I have, I hope, good friends from Africa who will assist me to continue to find them. In terms of have I been privileged in my research, I don't know about that. I'll tell you something. I work much harder than most people. I work much longer hours than most people. And I have made certain sacrifices in my personal life so that I can do this work. So I'm not sure about that part of the question, but I do think it's very important to address the issue of privilege and to let you know that I am aware of my privilege. I did not have control over it, but the parts I do have control over, I work with. Thank you.
No worries. All right, so thank you very much, Pam. Okay, so I wanted to talk about this broader challenge of access, which again is a big part of the theme of this panel is how do we create the space and the value that we're leaving on the table because we're not effectively bringing civil society and other actors into the process. So any other thoughts on this question as to how do we ultimately open up these spaces more effectively for a broader set of stakeholders? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Right. I think for a lot of, I see some of my colleagues from the public policy conversation, Nigeria, I think Tobekile, a couple of other colleagues here, who have been very active in the Internet Governance Forum processes, which is a UN sort of mechanism on building consensus on a couple of, on issues related to digitalization. And this platform happens at national level, sub-regional level, to regional level, all the way to the global spaces, so to say. And we, even within those processes, I think that's a process rather where civil society's voice has come out very, very strongly, but the voice of government has not been very strong. I think over the years we have seen the parliamentary network that was built in that space and really to engage again on broader technology policy issues from a rights-based approach. But we know what the challenges are this, and I think this has been reflected from practice, but also research that has come out of those platforms, that's those consensus building sort of forums do not make law-abiding or, policies or laws that are abiding, right? And so it's many of the instances, it becomes very confrontational. Many of the instances, some of the stakeholders believes that their voices are not being held, but also those are reflected at local level, right? Where civil society and other players are in the room and input is provided, for instance, and it's not reflected, for instance, in the final law. So we have those issues. I think the best way to deal with that is really to recognize that within, again, the public sphere, all the voices matters, right? And within the Internet Governance Forum or the spaces or in these governing issues of digitalization, all the voices matters. The voices of the users, the private sector, academia, civil society, government, and the regulators. So it's really, I think the challenge is on all of us to work together in this consensus building and really make sure that we build for things that are making sense or that makes most sense for us at local or whatever level that we engage. Thank you.
Absolutely. I see. Yeah, go ahead, Miriam.
Yeah. So I start by posing a challenge. Early this year, on a flight from, I think it was Nairobi to Kuala Lumpur, I cried for the first time while doing work around citizenship rights. Like proper bawling my eyes out. I think you might have met her. Her name was Daniela. She went and she shared her story on stage. She's a 16-year-old, especially now because we're talking about access to legal identity. Until you meet someone who has no business being in a room, actually has no business being in a room talking about access to legal ID, leave alone the people who, like inclusion, yes, we want to bring in people. But then until the day you meet a child, try to explain to you, because people have failed them time and again, exactly what access to legal ID should be. Then you have not seen anything. So my challenge to you and to ID for Africa and to everyone sitting in this room is yes, some of us work with community-based organizations. Yes, we have access to people who we can bring on stage and bring to the spaces. Some of them cannot even make it here because they actually can't even fly. They can come. So my challenge would be that leave alone all the academic jargon, the talk on normative frameworks. Let's bring the people that are actually affected properly. They come, they tell you their story, you cry, and then you go, you do your job properly. That is my challenge to this forum. Thank you.
Nice. Okay, so we're coming to the end. Give me a sec, Elizabeth. We're coming to the end. There's an interesting question here that I think each of you may have different responses to. We have about 5 minutes. I'm going to ask for short responses so that we can move through. But the question, I think, is really around knowledge production. It's framed around how to consolidate the production of knowledge by African researchers locally with the fast-paced rhythm of DPI and related issues are happening. And I think what I take from that is that all of these digital issues are quite emergent, and that governments are obviously moving quite quickly with their digital transformation processes. How can we create knowledge in the continent that is responsive to that and timeframes that make it actionable? So very quickly, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, on what ways you think you can do that from where you sit.
Yeah, and if it's okay, Matthew, I'll start. Understanding our context as Africa is key. Yes, we have DPI and the move to digitalize more, but understanding our challenges that are specific to our communities and being able to build for those challenges. And one of the key challenges around building in Africa is involving all stakeholders on the table. And at what stage do we involve stakeholders? So other than involving the stakeholders at the point of implementation, let's start involving them at the point of design. Okay. Start to ask communities what they want out of their DPI. Okay. And then we'll be able to get the solutions that work for us.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Suleimana?
Well, I think that I would reemphasize the importance to have every voice counted, every opinion involved, because at the end of the day, I believe and I have no doubt that we are talking about something for good. So we're talking about identity for good. And the question to ask is, if you ask somebody, who are you? I believe the person is going to tell you their name. My name is Suleimana. But apart from your name, what makes you you? And I think that is what identity is about. And so it's an important thing, but as I said, we need to involve everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, no worries. Okay. Mampenda, you want to go? Yeah, please.
Just maybe two points. The first is that we need international cooperation, a very strong one, a very equitable one, very fair one, but we also need national engagement. Research costs money, and we need our states, and we need our regional communities and African Union to bring money for research, for strong and local and relevant research. Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Just very briefly, I think each organization will have a different way of building knowledge. For us, we build knowledge through networks and through our research, and also through training. So we do work in Africa in this regard. We work with large communities, especially of data protection authorities. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, I think briefly from me is to use the lessons that we are picking up in this implementation, whether these lessons are not necessarily positive, and help us build better infrastructure or digital public infrastructure that we are doing here. And not use those stories in a way that is shaming us, but best learning experiences on how to implement beyond the systems that we are having right now. But also a call for funding and investment in the research area, particularly on local knowledge and promoting local knowledge and local research. We are very happy to get our expertise from experts from elsewhere, implementing systems in our countries, but also creating knowledge, and we find that acceptable, but not our local knowledge. And that's, I think, something we need to work on as an African continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Miriam, did you go? Yeah, please. Oh, you went already? Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed this panel. I think my goal was to show that in each, these are all colleagues that we've brought together from the continent, but partners outside of the continent. But I think what in our work we've found that many of these persons exist in all of your countries, and that there are coalitions that we can build at the national level, at the international level, with different stakeholders as we move towards achieving full participation for all persons in the society.
Matthew, thank you so much, and thank you for the panelists. You've done a great, great job, and this is what I had hoped for. Indeed, when we pushed for the slogan, empowering every voice, every choice, I want to reaffirm our commitment to empowering every voice. Indeed, and this is not after the fact, it has to be done as part of the process. So thank you for making that clear with your personal stories and making it concrete. And so we look forward to a partnership with all the civil society organizations. We believe there is no way this can be done without you. So thank you for being here with us in this family. I hope you feel the warmth of the welcome. Thank you very much. Matthew, thank you. We have a break now, but there is a family photo here. But the ambassadors, please wait if you are in the hall. After they take the panel photo, please come to the front.
Oh. Oh my, where's Dr. Atik? Let Dr. Atik go to the front, please. Are you taking the shot with him, Doctor? You've got to make way for Dr. Atik, please. Please. Doctor, let me take you down. Let me take you downstairs. Downstairs? Yeah. No, please. You're going to stand in the middle. Okay.